I've been working on a game system called Sprial for most of the quarantines, and I finally have something to show for it. It's about ready to test, and I'm going to need a lot of help doing it, so today we're going to go over the new Sprial game system and see how it works. Hi, I'm Joe, also known as Arcandio, and this is Joe's Table. What is the Sprial gaming system? Sprial is a tabletop role-playing game system like D&D, Pathfinder, Fate, etc. It is designed as a toolkit for designing campaigns, campaign settings, and whole TTRPGs, but it's also mathematical and uniform, avoiding edge cases and rules minutiae as much as possible. Sprial is narrative-driven, which means that what is possible in the game is largely determined by what makes sense in the fiction. Okay, let's talk about entities. In SGS, pretty much everything is an entity. Entities can be objects, characters, vehicles, powers, you name it. Entities are collections of stats and other entities. An example might be a player character with a sword. Both the character and the sword could have a melee skill, for example. The player can add the melee skill values together for dice rolls when they're using both the sword and the character. Another example might be a dragon and its claws. The natural weapons and special powers of creatures and characters are built as separate entities which are then added to other entities. A third example might be a spaceship with a bunch of crew members added to it. The pilot of the ship might have the navigate skill, but the total roll would be better when the ship uses both its own navigate and the navigate of the pilot. In general, we refer to entities that act on their own and take a turn in combat as characters, creatures, monsters, or NPCs. Conversely, we refer to entities that don't act on their own as objects, but they might also be vehicles or powers. Let's talk about stats next. Every entity in Sprial game system has access to all of the stats of the game, but it doesn't necessarily use every single one. To use a stat, the entity must pay for it. Each stat costs a specific amount of XP based on the value of that stat. The total XP of the entity is the sum of all of its XP values and the XP values of any attached entities like equipments, powers, or crew. There are several different kinds of stats, so let's talk about those next. The stats in the Sprial game system are categorized by what kind of stat that they actually are. So you have primary stats, which use dice, and then you have things like tactical stats or skills, which are bonuses to those dice. Let's talk about the roll mechanic next. That'll help make things make a little bit more sense. Now, this is going to sound complicated, but every roll mechanic sounds complicated when you break it down into every single part, so relax and don't worry. It doesn't take that long to get used to. First, obviously, is determining what you're trying to do. You'll use different skills for attacking with a sword versus trying to climb a streetlight, for example, but what you're trying to do also determines what kind of roll you're making. SGS divides rolls up into several categories. First, we have action categories. They're pretty self-explanatory, especially if you've played Fate before, so we're just going to go right through them. First is overcome, then create advantage, then attack, then defense, then initiative. Next, we have the resolution categories. First, we have success, which are normal checks that see whether or not you did a thing successfully. Next, we've got quality. These are things like crafting or performance or like side hustles or jobs, where the roll is more about how good you do rather than whether or not you succeeded. And then lastly, we have time. These are for determining how long it takes to do something. Next, you're going to figure out your roll. Mostly this is done ahead of time. Your roll for a given skill is equal to 1 die of your stats die size plus your skill bonus. If you're using a piece of equipment, you add the skill bonus from that piece of equipment too, but only for the same skill. Now roll the dice and count up your total. That's your base roll. So for example, say I have 1d6 agility and an attack with my melee skill at +2. If I roll 4, my base roll is 6. Next, you'll compare your roll to something. If it's a simple success test, you'll usually be trying to meet or exceed a target number. If it's an attack, it's usually an opposed roll against someone else's defense roll. So for example, the target of my attack is rolling dodge +2 with 1d4 agility and rolls a 2 on the die for a total of 4. If you're attacking, you next need to figure out your margin. Your margin is your base roll minus the defender's base roll. My 6 minus the defender's 4 is a margin of 2, for example. To figure out how much damage you're doing, multiply your margin by the damage of your weapon. My sword does 4 damage, but 4 times 2 is 8, which is pretty good. Now, instead of applying 8 damage directly to the defender, you check the damage against the target's damage thresholds. The target suffers the effect of the largest threshold the damage meets or exceeds. There are normally 3 thresholds: graze, wound, and trauma. The defender is a demon. Its graze threshold is 4, its wound threshold is 8, and its trauma threshold is 12. My attack met its wound threshold, so it takes a wound. For each threshold that you beat, the defender marks off 1 health box. Now here's the important part. Each box of health marked is a -1 penalty to rolls made by that entity. That means that every point of damage really counts. Being wounded in combat makes it hard to continue fighting. This prevents the unrealistic scenario where somebody acts perfectly fine until they take that last dart to the shin and then drop dead. Conversely, because characters are trying their very hardest to survive, there are options to modify rolls, block damage, or temporarily suppress the effect of your wounds. Next, let's talk about using tokens. In SGS, when you fail an attempted roll, you gain a token. Tokens are spent on a variety of things in the game, but mostly modify the way a roll works in some way. Tokens often rely on the aspects or flaws of the entity or the situation. I don't want to get into the details of all of them, but you can find more info down in the doobly-doo. Each of these action modifiers costs 1 token unless otherwise specified. Here's the list. You can invoke an aspect to gain a +2 bonus. You can bind an opponent's aspect to give them a -2 penalty. You can compel an entity to act within the bounds established by an aspect. You can double the range of weapons that have ranged. You can spend 2 tokens to take an extra action. You can ignore your wound penalties for 1 roll. You can move again. You can reduce the damage you're taking by 1 step to a minimum of 1. You can increase the damage you're doing by 1 step. You can roll 2 dice of your stat instead of 1 and take the higher of the 2. Or you can roll 1d4 instead of taking 0 if you have no stat or skill in that roll. So as you can see, there are a ton of tactical options available to you in Sprial Game System. The more your character gets knocked around, the more fuel they have to pull out some wicked moves down the line. So far I've described the basic version of Sprial Game System, or what we would call the core rules. One of the special parts of SGS is that you can change the rules to fit your game or your game world. SGS allows you to change stats, skills, equipment, and adversaries of your game to whatever you want. The goal of this is to allow you to build whatever kind of world you want to play in, or play whatever kind of character you would like. Instead of supporting only certain combinations of stats, races, powers, and so on, SGS allows anything so long as it's not too powerful and it's okay with the GM and the group. Whereas it's often hard to determine the value of a character or item in a traditional tabletop role-playing game, SGS instead builds everything off of a value system, so that you always know approximately how good something is. This way, when the GM gives you a 250 experience point budget, you can make just about anything from a myconid necromancer to a small dragon to a very powerful kobold. Up next, let's talk about the goals of Sprial Game System. Okay, so why am I making this game? In short, it's more of a matter of why I'm making this game and not some other one. SGS is the culmination of a lot of my thoughts and opinions on game design and storytelling in TTRPGs over the years. I want the system to get out of the way of my storytelling and for it to not interfere with the kinds of characters and events that I want to exist in my world. I want it to support conflicts where the attributes or facts of the characters in the scene are as important as their statistics. I want to be able to quickly whip up a new idea without having to spend days or weeks balancing it against existing content with little to no guidance. I don't want my characters to feel no effects whatsoever from combat, because a dragon chomping somebody's arm off is really different from you take 32 HP of damage with no consequences. I want to play and run games where there's more tactical options available to people on the battlefield than attack and attack harder occasionally. Lastly, I want to make a system that can support the many TTRPGs that I'm in the process of designing without inventing a new system for every single one. Well, that was a bit about the Sprial Game System by Void Spiral Entertainment. I hope you enjoyed. You can find more about the system, including how to get a copy for testing, down in the description. I'm game designer Joe Bush. I make tabletop role-playing games you can find on voidspiral.com and fantasy art that you can find on arcandio.com. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell, and all that, and I will see you in the next session.